In October 1965, less than a year after abolition, the resolve of Parliament would be tested by one of the most notorious murder cases of the 20th century.
We think of the mid-60s as this great utopian, happy-go-lucky, kind of orgiastic age where everyone's having a great time. In fact, the mid-60s was a much more anxious, darker time than we remember.
In what would become known as the Moors Murders, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley kidnapped, tortured and killed 5 children, burying them in shallow graves on Saddleworth Moor.
On these bleak and desolate moorlands, 1,600 feet up in the Pennines, senior police officers believe they'll find 2 more bodies, possibly a third.
It's impossible to overstate how shocking those crimes were, particularly when the tapes were played in court and then reported in the newspapers.
At their trial, there was public outrage when a tape recording was played to the court of Brady and Hindley torturing 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey.
And that means that within a year of the suspension of the death penalty, you have newspaper columnists, and particularly kind of, people in the pub, people on street corners and whatnot, calling for the death penalty to be brought back, because there are kind of 2 people who to people in the 1960s seem ideal candidates for the hangman's noose. It's Brady and Hindley.
The overwhelming majority wanted to see Brady and Hindley hang for their crimes. But public pressure could not convince the government. Brady and Hindley were both sentenced to life imprisonment. A life sentence for murder was now mandatory following the suspension of the death penalty in 1965.
The mandatory life sentence was brought in as a condition of abolishing the death penalty. Those who opposed abolition were told by those who advocated it and who in the end prevailed that they would always be safeguarded because there would be this mandatory life sentence.
The mandatory life sentence was aimed at extending the amount of time a convicted murderer could be imprisoned for.
In the days of capital punishment, those reprieved, and that was the majority of murderers who were reprieved, served sentences considerably lower than they would serve today, despite the media thinking we are soft on crime. Craig, who couldn't be sentenced to the hangman because of his age when Bentley was executed, served 11 or 12 years for the shooting of a police officer. Now, even as a 16-year-old, he would probably serve a minimum of 25, so sentence doubled.
In fact, under today's tariff system, some prisoners serving life sentences are eligible for early parole. But this raises its own moral questions about how the state punishes individuals, like Harry Roberts, who's been locked up for 44 years, convicted after the murder of 3 policemen in 1966.
I think it's extremely cruel to lock someone up forever, but in a slightly different way from executing them, because it's the gift that keeps on giving. If you see what I mean, you're in prison maybe for 40 or 50 years. I mean, Harry Roberts, who was the man who murdered the 3 policemen in Shepherd's Bush, is still in jail after 44 years. I happen to believe he should still be there because he committed 3 very, very nasty, gratuitous murders. And if you let someone like Harry Roberts out, and there has been talk about doing so, you're effectively saying to other people who might want to kill the police, oh yes, he was away for 44 years, but in the end, it's forgive and forget. Wouldn't it be the mark of a more humane society to execute him? And if that means dealing through the state in a final way with someone who has committed the most grave crime, then I don't see that that's a problem.
Well, I counter that by simply pointing out that as a matter of logic, it's much worse for an individual to spend the rest of their life on a prison than to be executed immediately. I don't take the view that there is somewhere down there a hell that all bad people are going to be tortured by. I think, if they're turned off, that's an end on it. And why give them the benefit of being turned off like that when they could be made punished for the rest of their lives? I think it's a far worse punishment, life in prison, because they suffer. They suffer.
In 1969, Parliament voted overwhelmingly in favour of permanently abolishing the death penalty for murder. 2 years later, capital punishment was also removed for arson in a Royal Naval dockyard. Now, hanging only remained for treason and piracy. Britain's new position was soon followed by other Western countries, like France and Spain, which through the 1970s would also stop using the death penalty. Even the USA, which hadn't executed anyone since 1967, suspended capital punishment in 1972.
In America, the instrument for the temporary abolition of the death penalty was not Congress, it was the Supreme Court, the one part of the government of America which is not susceptible to re-election. It was that body that actually declared that at least the process of executions in America was unconstitutional.
The Supreme Court's decision infuriated the majority of Americans.
Private papers of the Chief Justice, who was in the dissent, indicate that he thought that was the end of the death penalty in America, as did most of the abolitionists. They thought they had won their permanent victory. They couldn't have been more wrong. And the states immediately, responding to overwhelming public support for the death penalty and outrage at the United States Supreme Court decision, reenacted death penalty statutes.
In 1976, the Supreme Court was forced to review its decision in response to widespread public pressure.
Less than 2 years ago, death cells in prisons throughout America were emptied when the Supreme Court ruled against capital punishment. The court decided that it was unconstitutional because it was a cruel and unusual form of punishment, in the sense that it was so arbitrary. Some people would be sentenced to death and others merely to a term of imprisonment for the same offence. Now, though, the court is having to think again, and while it's doing so, death rows throughout the country are filling up again.
The Supreme Court voted to reinstate capital punishment. And in 1977, Gary Gilmore became the first person to be executed in the US for 10 years.
Gilmore eventually insisted that the state of Utah put him to death. So he was the first of many volunteers from death row, basically people who could save their own lives by continuing to appeal and to have their cases reviewed and have their cases delayed. He took the opposite path. He volunteered. The state of Utah put him to death, and from that day onwards, the execution pattern began once again in the USA. Very slowly at first. In 1977 there was only 2, and then in the early 1980s there were a handful each year. But by the end of the 1990s, there was almost 100 people being put to death each year.
Gilmore was executed by a firing squad in Utah. Since then, other US states have chosen to use the gas chamber or lethal injection to carry out death sentences. Gilmore's execution hit the headlines in the British press and inspired some British lawyers to offer to cross the Atlantic and help defend those facing the death penalty.
And the effectiveness claim would win.
Through the 1980s, British lawyers like Clive Stafford Smith took up cases that challenged America's right to execute.
In a fair world, you're going to win, but the world isn't always unfair, so we'll just have...
But I'd become obsessed with the death penalty, and this was from quite a young age. You know, I was very young when I was writing something about it. I was like 16 in school. And I thought it was a history paper. I thought the death penalty was history. And when I discovered that the Americans were still killing each other, I was really shocked.